Morally gray characters, the bane of anyone who's ever had to workshop the creative writing of teenagers. I kid, but morally gray characters have certainly developed something of a reputation in the writing zeitgeist, especially online. But today we're going to be talking about them, in terms of appeals, downsides, and how you might go about writing your own, without getting clowned on immediately. But of course, if we're going to do that, we need a definition for what exactly morally gray even is. This, as you may well know, is already the step where a lot of people tend to go wrong. But as such, a morally gray character is just this: someone who makes both morally good and morally bad decisions. That's it. It's really that simple. But the words both, morally, good, bad, and even decisions are all places where you can discuss several nuances as to how exactly they might matter, and are places where people might lose the interesting character dynamic that can come with a morally gray character and create something one note, or for lack of a better word, cringe. Of those words in that statement I just said, both is the most obvious of them that people trip up on. And making a character all good and no bad, or all bad and no good, is the most common failure of supposedly morally gray characters. While it is easy to make fun of people who do this, it is worth considering that finding a balance can be quite a challenge. Take, for example, characters A, B, and C. They're all fighting in a war, and in all ways except those that I'm about to describe, they are identical. Character A fights because their brother was captured by the enemy army and wants to free him. One time, he stole a Snickers bar from a corner store, and every now and again, he forgets to hold the door open for old ladies that enter buildings behind him. Character B fights because he likes killing people and wants to loot and pillage the enemy. But he's nice to one specific person on rainy Tuesdays, as long as it's also the first Tuesday of the month. Character C is fighting primarily for money. They need it to support their destitute family, but they do keep some of the money for themselves, and they do enjoy the fighting even despite acknowledging the brutality. They aren't cruel, but value their own life, and won't spare enemies if it imposes a risk to their own safety. Now tell me, dear and brilliant viewer o' mine, which of these three is a morally gray character? Of course, the answer I would expect to hear would be character C. Character A is not morally gray because his evils are entirely superficial and even held to the strictest of standards. Almost anybody would weigh the good of wanting to save one's family as being more relevant than the evil of not holding doors open for old ladies. This is often the morally gray of those who want their character to have a sort of edgier feel or aesthetic, but they aren't willing to go far enough to actually make them do something detestable. This is an understandable impulse. We're sort of uncomfortable seeing characters we like, which we generally do if we're the ones creating them, do things that we disagree with, or that go against our moral compass. It's fine to have a character A, but you should be honest about what they are. They are not morally gray, but a fundamentally good character who was slightly selfish one time and forgetful a few others. Character B is also not a morally gray character. His goods are entirely superficial. I'll even make a point about what it was. Even take away the on the first rainy Tuesday of the month part and just leave the only nice to one person thing, and you still don't really have a morally gray character. You have a villain with a soft side. This is the kind of character also made by a desire to be edgy, but where the uncomfort factor doesn't play in, and instead the edginess factor is exponentially increased. Villains are fun, we all know this. They can do and say things we never participate in real life, all without the consequences of actually harming anybody or causing any problems. And they're an exploration of ideas that we disagree with or find abhorrent. However, a villain is obviously not inherently a morally gray character, and that's fine. This is all connected to a related trend, the fairly common trope of having redeemed or redeemable villains. But the key part with those is that there have to actually be redeeming qualities for a character to be redeemable. A morally gray example of character B might be one who is otherwise mostly the same, but maybe they are very traumatized. One who grew up in desperate poverty, one who never had positive influences to show them a better way to live, one who deep down is scared and regretful and knows that the things they're doing are wrong, but doesn't know any other way to be. Importantly, none of those things are excuses, nor do they make their actions justified, but they do make them more complex and a little closer to being gray. But in the end, as said, character C is the most morally gray character of the selection. He has decent motivations and certain bad inclinations. However, now is also a good time to say that one of the most fair problems people have with morally gray characters is that morally gray is a very subjective idea. People are going to value or devalue certain moral actions differently depending on their own perspective. A good litmus test that most people will know about will be Darth Vader, who also addresses the redeemed villain topic from earlier. Despite the various flaws in the story of Anakin Skywalker, the end result is a man who is both directly responsible for the establishment of an evil galaxy-wide empire that destroyed planets, enslaved countless people, and otherwise repressed everyone under its rule. On the other hand, he was a young man expertly manipulated by the living embodiment of scheming evil, and was eventually turned, motivated by love for his son, to finally be the one who eliminated that evil from the galaxy forever. Unless you count those fanfictions some people made in the 2010s, I guess. In your mind, is Darth Vader a fallen hero who redeemed himself? A monster who only due to his own selfish emotions finally did one good thing only at the very end? Or something in the middle of even that? Personally, I find any of those interpretations to be pretty fair. And they are ultimately going to, once again, be subjective to any given person. And that is the appeal of morally gray in a sense. When done right, they produce topics for interesting characters, and reflections on the way we see the world and the actions of those who inhabit it. This is the part in the video where I tell you this was all a catfish, as I am wont to do in these videos, because I'm going to talk now about one of the best examples of a morally gray character in all of fiction. Not just books, mind you, fiction. And I'll stand by that claim. And that character would be Willie Stark from All the King's Men. Hey, what do you know? We've heard that name before on this channel for almost 5 hours, too. I'll be spoiling a fair bit of what happens in the book here, though nothing I'd say should hamper your enjoyment of it too much, should you not already know what I'm about to say. So Willie Stark is the author of All the King's Men, Robert Penn Warren's vision or version of Huey Pierce Long, the ever-controversial populist governor of Louisiana in the 1930s. People incorrectly say that All the King's Men is a political novel, and I don't care if the New York Times says it too. They're wrong. There are politics in it, but it isn't that, by Warren's own words, that the book is about. I have to be a curmudgeon about that every time I reference the book, I'm sorry. But the reason I bring it up at all is because the book isn't really about Warren's opinions on Long/Stark's politics themselves, but more so about the way that he conducts those politics and his own life. It's also where Willie Stark takes the idea of Huey Long and becomes Warren's own creation. But with that out of the way, the central problem with Willie is that he is one of the most charming people you'll ever read about. Every single line of his, down to his last words in the novel, are dripping with charisma. The emotional part of your brain is just screaming for you to want to be his friend, to agree with him, to side with him and wish him the best. And the structure of the novel encourages this attitude, actually, especially in the early stages. Pretty much everybody loves Willie. The protagonist, Jack Burton, is his right-hand man, his own wife is devoted, and he has several hangers-on, even some like Sugar Boy who give their life for him. Contrast this with the people we're shown that don't like Willie, especially at first. One of our first little character studies with him is when he was campaigning for a position that would determine who would build a new school. Willie supports hiring a group of mostly black workers, known to do good quality work for reasonable prices. But the powers that be are just the worst. They are utterly racist, refusing to hire the company Willie supports just because the majority of the workers are black. Not only that, but the group they do want to hire is entirely chosen via nepotism. The guy in charge of the company they want to hire is quite literally related to the decision makers. So powers that be build the schoolhouse their way, and then during a fire drill, the fire collapse escapes with a bunch of kids still standing on said fire escape. So that doesn't turn out too well, and Willie is immediately proven right, proven modern and wise. How couldn't you side with him? He's humble too. The novel discusses how he stayed up for all-nighters to pass the bar exam to become a lawyer and try to improve his own lot in life. And yet, it all starts to go to hell after Willie's popularity, gained after the schoolhouse incident, propels him into a governmental scheme. Worthless gubernatorial candidate A knows that worthless gubernatorial candidate B is popular in a lot of the areas Willie has been getting popular himself. So candidate A sends a guy to encourage Willie to start his own campaign with the secret intent of splitting the vote. Willie does and is convinced that he has a real chance. The guy candidate A sent convinced Willie entirely that this is a real grassroots movement to see a Willie start governorship. But Willie finds out this is not the case, and he starts drinking and he starts getting mad. From this point, we watch his slow descent. He begins cheating on his wife, made especially terrible by the fact that his wife is easily the most morally pure character in the novel. She quite literally is near faultless. He even cheats on the woman he's cheating on his wife with. He uses tactics of intimidation, blackmail, and fear to keep the people he's installed in their place. When one of his boys screws up, he makes him sign his own resignation letter so that Willie can date it and make it public whenever he wants to get rid of that guy if he messes up again. Worst of all, he makes his right-hand man, that protagonist Jack Burton, find dirt on his childhood mentor, Judge Irwin, and Jack finding that dirt indirectly leads to several people dying. Well, he even ends up screwing over Jack by cheating again with Jack's childhood love, Ann Stanton, which ends up being so traumatic to Jack that he ends up driving out to California from Louisiana just to disappear for a while. And while the reason that was even possible was due to Jack-related problems that caused him and Ann to split more, Willie still pulled the trigger there despite knowing how close the two of them were. At that point in the novel, you just hate the guy. His charm becomes poisonous and you just despise his two-faced nature. Every time he opens his mouth and you find yourself agreeing with him, you almost want to slap yourself in disgust once you remember the shady stuff he's been doing. And then, to make things even more complicated, at the very end of it all, in the aftermath of his son's crippling at a football game, he finally understands how wrong he's been acting. That all happens in a way I'll leave unexplained in this video, but it is there in the big one if you've got 4 hours and 45 minutes to spare. And in those moments, when he's finally going to clean up his act and do things the right way, he gets killed. Just like that, boom, no more Willie Stark. He is such a complex character, and I've never been able to decide, even after intensely studying the book 2 separate times, whether I love him or hate him. Literally, I love him. I consider someone like the Judge from Blood Meridian to be the epitome of a villain, but Willie Stark I consider to be the epitome of morally gray. And yet, as a person, I just can't make up my mind. In a purely utilitarian way, he did a fair amount of good for a large number of people, and the harm he did was generally concentrated to a smaller number of people. And yet we can't exactly measure goodness done versus evil done as some sort of unit. From a deontological perspective, he did a lot of pretty unjustifiable stuff that was not in any way necessary to accomplish the good things that he did, and yet he did still manage to do those good things too, despite being immoral. In summary, though, that is what a morally gray character looks like. The kind of person you can't exactly make your mind up about, or the one where even if you can, you still see the other side or have your own reservations. Morally gray is a concept that's unfortunately been sort of discarded as a serious thing, at least when it's emphasized as a significant factor in a story, but the capability to create dynamic, fascinating characters with it has never gone away. So what do you do if you actually want to make one of those morally good characters? Well, a good place to start, though not the only place to start, is to have your character choose a side in this following dichotomy. They are good to individuals and bad to groups, or bad to individuals and good to groups. What this essentially means is that one of the most common dynamics for a successful morally gray character is that their morals differ on how they treat the people closest to them as opposed to the broader collective of people that their actions might impact. Willie Stark, for example, is essentially terrible to all of the people he's close to, but his actions are helping pull the state of Louisiana into the modern age. Darth Vader is the opposite, where he acts as the enforcer of the Empire, killing and imprisoning people on a large scale, but on a small scale, it's his personal act of love that brings that empire down. Obviously, there's far more nuance to these characters than that. Vader is generally terrible on the small scale too for quite a long time. It's just that it's a small-scale good that finally changes him and ends the evil, not a large-scale good. There are other dichotomies you can choose from, though. Another way is to start with this separate, if similar one. You have an essentially good character who's done a universally evil thing in the past, or an essentially bad character who's done a universally heroic thing in the past. With this dichotomy, there's a little more setup, especially on the latter side. An essentially evil character who did heroic things in the past is pretty much every fallen hero. I don't want to overdo it, but once again, Anakin Skywalker. Or if you want a completely different kind of example, Archaon the Everchosen from Warhammer, who was a knight who served the god Sigmar before ascending to become the supreme champion of the Chaos Gods. Though he, of course, is the farthest thing in the world from morally gray that I can think of. He blew up the world just because he was mad. In either case, if you want an essentially evil character with good in his past to be actually morally gray, they need to struggle with that good thing they did, to question why they did it, and if they should consider being the person who would do such a thing again. And then, of course, is when we get the opposite, the essentially good character with evil in their past. This is one that's near and dear to me because the main character of my novel is this very archetype. In these cases, the character needs to struggle with and attempt to reconcile the evil thing they did. Do they deny it? Do they hate themselves for it? How do other people who know about it treat them? Do be aware with these, though. There are some quite infamous cases, some of which have been very well discussed on YouTube, where a writer has a character that has done extensive and cruel acts of evil to the extent that there really isn't any making up for it anymore. So just be aware of not overdoing it. But once you've gotten that far, you get to the almost more broad question of why. A morally gray character is a character in conflict with themselves. And so, what is the source of that conflict? What elements in their life led them to do the things or act in the ways that contradicted the person they believe themselves to be? In the case of Willie, though we're never in his head, we know a lot of his vices come from the extreme stress of his job, and are in some way justified to him by the idea that in doing such a great service for the state of Louisiana, he is therefore allowed to take some certain liberties. Another example I could have easily used to talk about for 10 minutes would be Rodion Romanovich Raskolnikov from Fyodor Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment. I had to record that line several times because of those freaking names. And with that, I found a way to reference all three of my favorite novels in one video. Anyway, Raskolnikov is useful here because he's an example of an essentially good person who did a terrible thing. His terrible thing, of course, was murdering the pawnbroker alongside the innocent bystander Lizaveta. Now, in saying that, there are definitely good reasons to argue that Raskolnikov has nothing good about him at all, actually. But to save us a bit of time, I'll say that I do respect that interpretation, but given the context of the novel and Dostoevsky himself, I disagree. In either case, going with the assumption he is a good man who did a bad thing, his why is that he deluded himself in such a way that he believed that he was special, that he was like Napoleon and therefore justified in doing whatever he wanted with his own free will, including murdering the cruel old pawnbroker and including taking out Lizaveta too because she saw him. However, the rest of the span of the novel is him dealing with the fact that he knows it was the wrong thing to do and eventually accepting the punishment that he deserved for his crime. Aha. This is all to say that a person's why for this contradiction in their view of themselves can take on a great deal of forms. They can be ideological, philosophical, a heat-of-the-moment mistake, or anything else. But figuring out why they did it and how they will deal with it is what actually adds that essential depth to a morally gray character, and once you've got that, you'll be well on your way. Anyway, with that, I think I'm about done rambling about moral grayness. I've said the phrase enough that it's lost all meaning to me. If you have any thoughts of your own about morally gray characters, let me know about them in the comments. I hope you enjoyed, and since we're still small here at JBat, every like and subscription goes a really long way. Anyway, if you want to hang out with my editor and I, we have a Discord, and if for some reason you're crazy enough to want it, we have a Patreon and channel memberships, all linked in the description below. I've also got to thank Shadowrunner, our $10 patron, a Knight of the Inner Circle, and a pretty cool dude. And remember, if you finish this video and then start making a morally gray character by naming them something like Night Shadow Darkshade, I'm coming for you.